Hello everybody, welcome to Asura Psych. I'm Asura, and today we're going to be talking about how personality type develops with age and maturity, and how the process of going through one's childhood, teenage years, and early adulthood can influence the development of type and one's cognitive functions. Let's get into it. So to understand how type develops in people, you need to first understand what Carl Jung kind of envisioned when he was thinking of cognitive functions within the type. And the way that Carl Jung envisioned cognitive functions was that one function would rule the other ones, in a sense that one function was excessively dominant. It was the dominant cognitive function. And this is something that the Briggs model shares as well, but the problem with the Briggs model is that sometimes people tend to place too much emphasis on the secondary function, or they'll tend to view the two functions within the top two functions as almost even, whereas in the true Jungian analytical perspective, one function was very much so more present than the others. And this is very noticeable when you're looking at how one develops alongside their type. Because Carl Jung, when he thought of the functions and he wrote about them in his book Psychological Types, he described them in a way that reflected them as the perfect portrait of someone of that type. So when he described the 8 cognitive functions, he almost described them as a person who only had that function. Like if this function was a person, this is what this person would be like. And that's how he described them. And that's almost like how children are during their early stages of really beginning to interact with the world. Children get into the habit of really practicing and engaging with their cognitive function, their preferred function. And they really start to use this to interact with almost everything in the world around them. And you'll notice that kids, it's almost easy to type them once they hit around the age of like 7 or 8, because they're really using one function above all the others, because they haven't even begun the process of developing their second function. So when it comes to developing the second function, this is something that typically happens around the teenage years, or as someone enters early adulthood. And when one begins to develop their second function, they first have to they have to crawl before they walk, and they tend to make mistakes. As someone develops their secondary function, they might tend to overuse it or over-engage with it. You might find someone like an ISTJ engaging with extroverted thinking in this very overt and critical way that isn't reflective of their true nature or the kind of person that they really are. But that's because as they develop this tool, this secondary function that's supposed to help them obtain the goals of their primary function and to balance out the personality, that they tend to overuse it or use it in ways that aren't reflective of them as people. The process of developing the secondary function in this kind of overused way begins to slow down, usually around the late teens and early 20s. And on a biological level, this can be due to the fact that brains tend to stop development at around 20, which is why the drinking age is 21 in many countries, because they believe that that's the age where the brain is kind of hit its final point of how it needs to be to function properly. But on a cognitive function level, this just tends to be the age when people really begin to even out or balance out if they developed healthily and in a normal fashion. Now, some people who don't develop in normal ways might not develop their second function in a healthy manner at all, or they might kind of latch onto their secondary function and tend to overuse it in this highly unhealthy way for long periods of their life. But for most people, once they hit around their 20s, maybe even their mid-20s, is when they really begin to start to settle down and even out in the cognitive function balance between the dominant and the secondary function. So the tertiary function is a bit different, because the tertiary function is developed in a way that is not like the first two functions, because the tertiary function is neither antagonistic or supportive directly to the dominant function. It is important to note that beyond the top or primary two functions, Jung kind of believed that these last two functions didn't play as major as a role in the personality as the first two did. Now, the repressed, I would say, even plays more of a role in the personality than the tertiary does, because the repressed function is antagonistic to the dominant function. It is the direct opposite. It is the repressed form of the primary way in which we engage in the world. And when we're put into moments of stress, this is the function that tends to come out, the repressed function. But this isn't the case with the tertiary function most of the time. So the tertiary function just tends to be this part of ourself that isn't directly engaged with. I sometimes call it the blind spot function, because we don't even really tend to think about it. And it's one that I think develops at varying degrees and varying rates for different people. For example, an INTJ in their early 20s might have begun the process of developing their introverted feeling, while an INTJ in their late 40s might not have even started that process. And it's not something that is typically actively engaged in, and that's important to note when you're thinking about developing cognitive functions, because you don't develop them in a conscious way. You don't actively say, well, I want to be better at this function, because that's not how that works. You can't say, well, I'm going to work on developing this function, or I'm going to work on developing this part of myself that really is repressed, because while you can work on them, they're never going to be natural to you if they're not part of your dominant processes or your dominant ways of engaging with the world. For example, an INFP trying to actively engage in extroverted feeling types of behaviors isn't going to end well for the INFP, because their primary way of engaging with the world is through introverted feeling. Now, the Briggs model differs from the socionics model in that Jung and Briggs didn't believe that functions existed in two forms at one time. So you didn't have people who had like first slot introverted feeling with fifth slot extroverted feeling, because in their model, they believed that all the functions existed in one form, and then that was how you engaged with the world in that way. And this can be seen, for example, as Jung believed somewhat that the dominant function was actually so overwhelmingly powerful in the personality that an individual might have all of their last three functions in the opposite attitude. And that's where Briggs almost differed from Jung, because Jung somewhat proposed the idea that the tertiary function could also be in the opposite attitude from the dominant function. Now, people have debated this, and this is actually a topic that is still up for debate in the actual Myers-Briggs Foundation and scientific community. Most people tend to agree that the dominant and tertiary functions match in terms of attitude, and that's actually what I agree with as well. But I believe that Jung was onto something, and that the development of the tertiary function can really vary. I think it's more possible that the tertiary function could show attributes of being in the opposite attitude than it would be for it to just be completely strict to the same attitude as the dominant function. So let's talk about the repressed function, or the fourth slot function. Despite what people say, I don't think people can really develop the repressed function in a way that they think they can. Because the repressed function is antagonistic and opposite of the dominant function, which is our primary way of engaging with the world, there's no real way that we could ever learn to use it in a healthy manner, because it's always antagonistic. It's always opposing the way in which we literally directly engage with the world at almost all times. But we can learn to manage it and learn when we're beginning to abuse the issues associated with it. Like I talked about in my repressed extroverted sensing video, once a person begins to realize that they're falling into a state or a grip with their repressed function, then they can really learn and start to take note of when those things are happening and how they can deal with situations like that. But I think for even the most well-trained people and people with high levels of discipline, it is extremely hard to manage the repressed function. It's not something that you can ever really master in the terms of Jung and Briggs model. I think it's really important to think about perspective when you're talking about developing personality type. Because if you're someone who has, say, for example, introverted feeling, and you say, well, I want to develop my extroverted feeling, that's not really how the theory works, and that's not really how things are meant to work. If you're someone with extroverted feeling and you try and force yourself into using skills and traits typically associated with extroverted feeling, then you're never really going to be presenting the true self. And when you do present this extroverted feeling side of yourself, or what you think is probably extroverted feeling, it's not going to be a true representation of who you are as a person. And the odds are it's just a twisted version of introverted feeling that you've kind of hoped would come out in a way that you perceive extroverted feeling as. So it's important, in my opinion, to instead take note of your strength areas, then take note of your weakness areas, and kind of use your strengths to support your weaknesses, or really think about how you can avoid the problem areas of your weaknesses instead of trying to be someone you aren't. Because if you're trying to be somebody you aren't, you're just going to lead yourself into a worse mental state. People should really tend to focus on their strengths as individuals and then use those strengths to become the best version of themselves. All right, everybody, I hope you've enjoyed this video on personality type and how it develops with age and maturity. I think it's important for people to know the ideas associated with this, because It's important to realize that not everyone may be at the same stage in their life, and that you as an individual may be at a stage in your life where you're not truly reflecting your dominant function or who you are as a person, and you may just be going through a developmental phase where you're using a part of yourself that isn't your normal way of interacting with the world. Just a quick reminder that I do personality typing sessions, and you can check out the link to my website in the description box below. This has been Asura at Asura Psych. Have a good one.